The desert was quiet except for the groaning wind that carried sand across broken stone and twisted metal. Among the scattered wreckage of forgotten machines, a man crouched beside a battered heater, coaxing a flame from scraps of fuel he had scavenged. His hands were calloused, his nails black with dirt, but his eyes held the stubborn light of someone who refused to vanish. His name was Corin, and to the city beyond the dunes he was nothing but a homeless drifter, an outcast who lived among trash and rust. Corin had seen ships fall from the sky before. Most came down in fire and never left anything but scorched craters and burnt bones, but this wreck was different. The impact had rattled the valley at dawn, sending plumes of dust spiraling high above the cliffs. Curiosity had led him there, hunger had kept him searching, and survival had made him brave enough to approach the ruins. Among broken plates of metal and cracked alloy, he found something he had never seen, a body glowing faintly blue beneath a torn uniform. The alien lay motionless, its chest barely rising. Corin thought at first it was dead, just another corpse to pick clean, but then its eyes fluttered, bright and unnatural like stars burning inside ice. That single movement struck Corin harder than hunger ever had. Against every instinct to run, he dragged the being closer to the heater, wrapping it in what scraps of cloth he owned. He had no idea if it could even survive the cold of night, but doing nothing felt wrong in a way he could not explain. He poured a thin stream of boiled water into a metal cup, then trickled some drops onto the alien's lips. To his shock, it swallowed weakly. Relief surged through him, mixing with fear. What was he doing? If the city guards found him harboring something like this, he'd be executed, or worse, used as bait for interrogations. Yet alone out here in the forgotten waste, he felt like the only witness to something extraordinary. For once in his life, Corin held a secret that could change everything. The alien's face was smooth and almost too perfect, its skin the shade of polished sapphire. Its uniform bore strange insignias, golden trims marked by burns and ash. Corin traced one symbol with his finger, memorizing it before guilt made him pull back. He had lived among scraps for years, forgotten by everyone who mattered, but this creature, it looked like it had fallen straight out of the stars. A being of importance, a being that should not need him. And yet here it was, breathing because he chose not to walk away. The sun fell quickly in the wasteland, bringing with it a chill that bit through skin and bone. Corin moved the heater closer, shielding the alien from the wind. He whispered words of comfort, though he doubted it could understand. The sound of his own voice kept him from unraveling. He talked about the city that cast him out, the people who turned their backs, and the nights he had gone hungry because he was invisible. For once there was someone who couldn't judge him, someone who had no history of him at all. When darkness settled, the stars emerged in fierce clarity, painting the sky with endless light. Corin stared upward, realizing this alien had come from somewhere out there, those glowing dots that mocked him with their unreachable promise. He wondered what it had seen, what worlds it had known, and why fate had brought it crashing into his lonely corner of the desert. Questions swirled, but answers remained locked behind shallow breaths and unconscious silence. The heater sputtered, its fuel dwindling. Corin cursed under his breath, fumbling for scraps of wire and wood to keep it alive. He didn't have much, but he gave what little he had without hesitation. Hunger and cold were old enemies. He could endure them. The alien, he sensed, could not. It was strange to care this much about something he had just found, but there was a weight in his chest, an instinct that told him this moment mattered more than any day he had lived before. At intervals, the alien shifted, murmuring sounds that weren't words Corin knew. The tones were soft, melodic, like music carried on the wind. He leaned closer, straining to catch them, but they slipped away into the night. Still, the sounds were proof of life, and that was enough. Corin smiled, though his lips were cracked and dry, and poured another trickle of water between the creature's lips. Somewhere deep down, he hoped that when it woke, it would remember him as the one who didn't leave it to die. Hours stretched on, each second heavy with anticipation. Corin's eyes drooped, exhaustion threatening to pull him under, but he resisted. He had spent so many nights asleep on cold stone, wrapped in rags, ignored by the world. Tonight felt different. Tonight he was guarding something precious, something larger than himself. He feared that if he closed his eyes, the universe would snatch it away. The wreck behind them groaned, metal warping under shifts of cooling heat. Corin glanced back often, half expecting scavengers to appear or soldiers from the city to arrive. He knew he couldn't defend both himself and the alien if trouble came, but as the silence held, he dared to hope they were alone. The wreckage was a graveyard, and graveyards seldom drew crowds until morning. The alien stirred again, its fingers twitching, skin glimmering faintly in the starlight. Corin reached for its hand, surprised by the warmth radiating through the blue skin. It was alive, truly alive, and he felt a strange surge of pride. For once in his miserable existence, he had done something that mattered. Not for survival, not for scraps, but because it was right. The heater finally dimmed, flames reduced to embers. Corin pulled the alien closer, pressing his own threadbare coat around both of them. He shivered violently but forced his body to still. If the alien survived the night, then maybe he could find more fuel, maybe even figure out how to repair a piece of the wreck for shelter. Possibilities bloomed wild and impossible, but hope made them feel real. Sleep came in fleeting bursts, each one broken by a noise or a shift of the wind. Corin kept checking the alien's chest, reassured each time he saw it rise and fall. He found himself wondering what it would say when it woke, what kind of voice it would have. Would it thank him? Would it even understand gratitude? Or would it see him as nothing more than a primitive vagrant unworthy of its attention? Somewhere before dawn, as the sky grew pale with the promise of sunrise, the alien's eyes opened again. This time they did not close. They burned brighter than before, filled with a depth that made Corin feel exposed. He froze, uncertain whether to speak or stay silent. Then the alien's lips parted and it whispered something soft, too soft for him to understand but filled with intent. Corin felt the sound resonate in his bones as though meaning existed beyond words. The alien tried to sit up, but its body betrayed it, trembling with weakness. Corin pushed gently against its shoulders, urging it to rest. "Not yet," he said, his voice low. "You're safe." He had no idea if it understood, but the alien's gaze lingered on him, steady and unblinking, as though memorizing his face. A long silence followed, broken only by the sigh of wind and the crackle of dying embers. Corin shifted uncomfortably under that gaze, unsure why it made him feel both small and important. He wasn't used to being seen, truly seen by anyone, yet here was a being from beyond the stars, focusing on him as if he mattered. The alien raised its hand weakly, touching its chest, then extending a trembling finger toward him. Corin frowned, confused, but something told him it was trying to communicate. He tapped his own chest in return. "Corin," he said. "That's me, Corin." The name felt strange on his tongue, like an offering. The alien blinked, then repeated a sound that almost echoed his name, though distorted and strange. Still, it was enough to send a shiver down his spine. He didn't know what fate had tied them together, nor what dangers lay in the city if this discovery came to light. But as dawn painted the desert gold and the wreckage glimmered with morning frost, Corin realized his life had already changed. He was no longer just a forgotten outcast. He was the guardian of something extraordinary. And for the first time in years, he felt a spark of destiny. The morning light revealed the extent of the wreckage more clearly than Corin had dared to look the night before. Twisted panels jutted out at impossible angles. Wires hung like vines, and the scorched earth bore a crater where the craft had torn into the desert floor. He had scavenged wrecks before, but never one that looked so foreign. The technology shimmered faintly, humming with a kind of power he did not understand. Something inside him warned against touching it, though his hands ached with the hunger of a scavenger. The alien's breathing grew steadier with the warmth of the new day. Corin searched the wreckage for anything useful, keeping an anxious eye on his charge. He found containers of strange metal that wouldn't open, a shard of translucent glass that shimmered with moving patterns, and what looked like a weapon too heavy for him to lift. He dragged smaller pieces closer to his camp, knowing instinctively that some of them might be vital to the alien's survival, though their purpose escaped him. When he returned to the alien's side, he found its eyes open again, clearer this time, less clouded by pain. They locked onto him with a strange intensity, and he felt the weight of that gaze as though it could peer into his thoughts. The alien attempted words, its voice soft and melodic, but Corin shook his head helplessly. "I don't understand," he admitted, feeling shame burn in his chest. He had never felt so powerless in front of another being. The alien studied him for a long moment, then touched a small device on its wrist. The cracked metal blinked faintly with light, and suddenly a new voice echoed in the air. Flat, mechanical, but comprehensible. "Name," it said, tilting its head toward him. Corin froze, then pressed a hand to his chest. Corin. The device repeated the sound in the alien's tongue, and the alien nodded slowly. Kazai, it said, then tapped its own chest. Corin understood. Kazai. That was its name. A strange relief washed over him. Names made things real, anchored them in a way that survival never did. He repeated it softly, Kazai, and the alien's eyes softened. For a moment, Corin felt as if he had passed some unspoken test, a bridge forming between them across the gulf of their worlds. Yet with the bond came a deeper unease. If Kazai had a name, then Kazai had a people, a place, and most dangerously, enemies. Kazai's voice grew stronger as the wrist device translated its words. Crash, pursuit, danger. The broken phrases filled Corin with a chill. Whoever had brought Kazai down might still be out there, searching. He looked to the horizon, suddenly aware of how exposed they were in the desert basin. The city guards were not the only threat now. Something worse might be coming, something far beyond his comprehension. He scrambled to prepare for the possibility. Gathering scraps of metal, he created makeshift barricades around the heater, though they would offer little protection. He searched for tools sharp enough to use as weapons, but all he had was a rusted blade barely fit for cutting rope. Every task felt small, futile, yet he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that he was no longer just protecting himself. For the first time in his life, another life depended on him. Kazai tried to sit up, groaning as pain rippled through its body. Corin supported it, steadying the alien's shoulders. Its uniform bore burns and tears that revealed wounds unlike any he had seen before. Deep, glowing veins of energy beneath the skin, pulsing faintly as if fighting to knit themselves together. He recoiled at first, but then forced himself to hold steady, wrapping the wounds in strips of cloth. The alien's body was different, but pain was universal. He understood that much. The sun rose higher, beating down on them with merciless heat. Corin poured the last of his water into a dented canteen, sharing it carefully with Kazai. He ignored his own thirst, letting the alien drink first. Every choice he made cut deeper into his survival, but he could not bring himself to act otherwise. Compassion was costly, yet it gave him a strength that surprised even himself. It was as though the universe had finally handed him a role, a purpose, instead of leaving him to rot in the margins. At midday, the wreckage stirred with faint energy. One of the panels flickered, emitting pulses of light that danced across the sand. Kazai lifted its head weakly, eyes widening in recognition. Through the translator, the alien murmured, "Beacon, signal, not safe." The words struck Corin like a blow. A distress call. The wreck was calling out, and not just to friends, it could be guiding enemies right to them. Fear gnawed at him, but he refused to surrender. He scavenged furiously, pulling apart panels until he found a faintly glowing core deep in the wreckage. It pulsed like a heartbeat, and every instinct told him not to touch it. Yet when Kazai whispered, "Stop, Beacon," he knew what he had to do. He ripped loose a length of pipe and smashed it against the core until the light sputtered and died. Silence followed, heavy and complete. His chest heaved, but Kazai's nod of approval gave him strength. As the day wore on, the bond between them grew in fragments of words and gestures. Kazai tried to explain more, though the translator struggled with broken phrases. Corin learned that Kazai was not just a traveler but a soldier, part of a conflict that stretched far beyond Earth. The mention of war made Corin's stomach twist, but he pushed the fear aside. He couldn't afford to think of galaxies burning when survival meant lasting through the night. That night the stars returned in their endless brilliance, and Corin found himself studying them with new eyes. He imagined ships darting between those points of light, civilizations he could never comprehend, wars that had nothing to do with him. Yet somehow one of those wars had fallen into his world, into his care. He was a man who had been cast aside, yet now he held a thread tied to something vast. The thought made his chest ache with awe and terror. Kazai spoke softly before sleep claimed him again. The translator rendered the words slowly. "You saved me, you matter." Corin froze, his throat tightening. No one had ever told him that before. The city had told him he was worthless. His family had forgotten him. Strangers had stepped over him. And yet here was a being from the stars telling him he mattered. The weight of those words was almost too much to bear. Corin stayed awake long after Kazai's breathing steadied, staring into the desert night. He thought about the dangers coming for them, about the fact that he could run now, vanish back into obscurity. But he knew he wouldn't, not anymore. Something had shifted inside him, something he could not undo. He had been invisible for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to live for more than himself. Now with Kazai, he had no choice but to fight. Near midnight, a sound broke the silence, the faint thrum of engines carried by the wind. Corin's heart leapt into his throat. He scrambled to cover the heater and dragged debris over their small camp. Kazai stirred, whispering one chilling word through the translator. Hunters. Corin pressed himself flat against the sand, clutching the rusted blade in his hand. His pulse thundered in his ears. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of failing someone who needed him. The noise faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Corin exhaled shakily, sweat chilling on his skin despite the desert heat. He looked at Kazai, who met his eyes with grim understanding. This was only the beginning. The wreck had drawn attention, and sooner or later, someone would find them. Their fragile bond would be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. As dawn approached again, Corin realized the truth. He was no longer just surviving. He was caught in a war between stars with an alien soldier by his side. And though fear gnawed at him, there was also fire in his chest, a spark of destiny he had never known before. The third morning began with silence that was too sharp, too heavy, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. Corin rose stiffly from the sand, joints aching, and scanned the horizon. The wreckage still smoked faintly, its torn edges glinting beneath the sun. Nothing stirred nearby, yet the memory of the hunter's engines from the night before clung to him like a shadow. He felt danger pressing closer even if it wasn't visible yet. Kazai sat upright now, though his movements were weak and shaky. His wounds glowed faintly through the makeshift wrappings, as though some energy beneath his skin resisted the damage. Corin watched the alien test his limbs carefully, grimacing but refusing to collapse again. There was resolve in his posture, the kind of determination Corin had only seen in fighters who refused to yield even when broken. For the first time, Corin saw not just a survivor, but a warrior who had been stripped bare by fate. The translator device crackled when Kazai spoke. Hunters return, must move. Corin's gut tightened. He had always lived among the ruins because the world forgot about him there. But hiding was no longer an option. If the hunters were truly coming, this basin would become a trap. He looked around at the towering cliffs that hemmed them in, realizing with dread how exposed they were. They had to leave, though he had no idea where they could possibly go. Kazai tried to stand, swaying dangerously. Corin rushed to support him, draping the alien's arm over his shoulders. The weight was heavier than he expected, solid with muscle and armor. But he grit his teeth and bore it. One step at a time, he muttered. The alien glanced at him, then repeated softly through the translator, 1 step. The phrase echoed strangely, as though it carried more than its literal meaning. They abandoned the wreckage, leaving behind the faint traces of fire and the shattered beacon. Corin couldn't help but glance back at the broken ship. Its silent form crouched like a dead beast in the sand. Part of him mourned it. Not because it was his, but because it had been Kazai's bridge to the stars. Now it was nothing but a grave marker. They walked away slowly, burdened by exhaustion and the weight of survival. Two outcasts in their own ways. The desert stretched endlessly before them. Heat shimmered across the horizon, waves of light that promised illusions of water they would never find. Corin's throat burned, his lips cracked, yet he forced himself forward. Each step felt like defiance, as if moving itself was an act of rebellion against despair. Kazai leaned on him heavily, his breath ragged but determined. Together they carved a path through dust and silence. As the sun climbed, they stumbled across the ruins of an old outpost, half buried in sand. Rusted towers leaned drunkenly, their wires dangling like skeletal arms. Corin guided Kazai inside, grateful for the shade. The structure smelled of rust and rot, but it was shelter. He settled Kazai onto a broken cot, then scoured the remains of cabinets and crates. Most were empty, picked clean long ago, but luck guided his hands to a sealed canister of stale water. It tasted foul, but it was life. Kazai drank with visible relief, his glowing veins dimming slightly as if calmed by the liquid. Corin sipped what remained, ignoring the sour taste. They rested in silence for a time, each lost in thought. For Corin, the quiet was filled with questions he dared not voice. What did these hunters want? Why was Kazai important enough to be pursued across the stars? And why had fate thrust Korin into the center of it? When Kazai finally spoke again, his words were clearer. Hunters, not men. Beasts, machines made to destroy. Korin shivered at the thought, picturing relentless predators forged from steel and hate. He had no weapons to face such things, no plan, no allies. Yet Kazai's calm acceptance of their reality steadied him. If the alien could endure the weight of being hunted by monsters, then Korin could endure standing beside him. That night they built a small fire from broken furniture. Its smoke curled into the sky, a risk Korin hated but warmth they needed. He shared stories as the flames crackled, stories of the city that had cast him out, of nights spent shivering in alleys, of people who never once looked him in the eyes. Kazai listened intently, his strange gaze never wavering. When he finally spoke, the translator echoed, "Alone, you?" "Same." Korin nodded, throat tight. They were both exiles, both forgotten in their own worlds. Sleep came fitfully. Korin woke often to strange sounds outside the outpost, the shifting of sand as if something prowled unseen. Once he thought he saw red lights flickering in the dunes, but when he blinked, they were gone. Fear burrowed deep into him, yet every time he glanced at Kazai sleeping restlessly, he found the courage to stay put. If danger came, he would not abandon him. Not now. At dawn, the sound of engines returned, louder this time. Korin rushed to wake Kazai, who pushed himself upright with grim determination. Together they peered out from the cracked walls of the outpost. Across the desert, dark shapes moved, sleek forms gliding low, their outlines unnatural. The hunters had returned. Red lights burned in the haze, moving in unison, too precise to be human. Korin's breath caught. Machines, just as Kazai had warned. Panic clawed at him, but Kazai's calm voice steadied him. "Hide, survive, fight, later." Korin nodded, dragging debris across the outpost's entrance. They crouched in the shadows, hearts pounding as the machines swept closer. Their hum was low and menacing, like predators sniffing for prey. Korin gripped his rusted blade, knowing it was useless but unable to let go. He refused to meet death with empty hands. The machines passed dangerously close, their red lights scanning the sand. Korin held his breath, pressing against Kazai's side. For a moment he thought they were discovered, that the machines would tear through the walls and end them. But then just as suddenly as they came, the hunters veered away, drifting back into the desert. Korin exhaled shakily, his body trembling with the release of fear. They had survived. Barely. When the danger passed, Kazai touched his chest and whispered something the translator rendered as strength. Not weapon, you. Korin stared at him, stunned. He had always believed he was nothing, weak, forgotten, unworthy. Yet Kazai saw strength where Korin saw emptiness. The weight of that trust pressed on him, heavy but empowering. If Kazai believed in him, perhaps he could believe in himself. The rest of the day was spent in tense silence, gathering strength for what was to come. Korin repaired what little he could of the outpost, patching holes with scraps. He sharpened his blade against stone, though it barely improved. Kazai meditated quietly, his glowing veins pulsing in rhythm with his breathing. There was power in him still, hidden but waiting. Korin could only wonder when or if it would reveal itself. As the sun set once more, painting the desert in blood-red light, Korin realized he was no longer afraid of tomorrow. The fear was still there, gnawing, but it was no longer the only thing. In its place burned a strange determination, a promise he had made silently to himself. He would not fail Kazai. The hunters would come again, stronger, relentless. But he would stand, not as an outcast, not as a forgotten man, but as someone who mattered. When night fell, the desert seemed alive with whispers of danger. Yet Korin closed his eyes beside the alien, clutching his blade with steady hands. Tomorrow would bring fire and steel. Tomorrow would test everything. And tomorrow, for the first time, he would not face it alone. The fourth dawn broke red, a sun rising like a wound across the horizon. Korin woke to the rumble of distant thunder, but the sky was clear. It wasn't weather. It was the sound of machines moving closer, a storm of engines sweeping across the desert. His heart hammered in his chest as he shook Kazai awake. The alien opened his eyes at once, as if he had been waiting for this moment. His glowing veins pulsed brighter, casting light across the ruined walls of the outpost. The translator device flickered as Kazai spoke. "No more running. Us stand." Korin stared at him, torn between fear and resolve. The hunters were coming, and hiding would not save them this time. He gripped his rusted blade, feeling the weight of his choice. For years he had been invisible, unseen by the world, but today the universe itself seemed to demand that he be more. The thought terrified him, and yet it filled him with fire. The sound of the hunters grew louder until the walls trembled. Shadows appeared in the dunes, sleek insect-like machines with legs that tore into sand, their eyes burning red. They moved with terrifying precision, surrounding the outpost like wolves closing on prey. Corin's breath caught, but Kazai rose shakily to his feet, energy shimmering faintly around his body. "Together," he said through the translator, and Corin nodded, his throat dry. They would face this side by side. The first machine lunged, crashing through the wall in an explosion of dust and metal. Corin swung his blade wildly, sparks flying as it scraped across steel armor. It was useless, but he did not stop. He screamed as he struck again and again, driving the creature back an inch at a time. Then a burst of blue light seared the air beside him. Kazai, summoning energy from within, blasting the machine with a force that sent it crumpling into the sand. Corin stared in awe, chest heaving. The outpost shook as more hunters poured in. Corin fought with desperate ferocity, hacking at limbs, throwing debris, anything to slow them. He was small, fragile, but he refused to fall. Every strike bought Kazai a heartbeat to unleash another pulse of energy. The alien's strength grew with each moment, his wounds knitting under the glow of power. Together they became a storm of defiance, one human with nothing, one alien with everything to lose. But the hunters were endless. For every one that fell, two more surged forward. Corin's arms ached, his blade nicked and bent. He stumbled, nearly crushed beneath a steel claw when Kazai pulled him back with impossible speed. "No die," the alien growled, voice clear even without the translator. Corin nodded, teeth clenched. He wouldn't die here. Not like this. Not when his life had finally begun to matter. A massive shape loomed in the distance, a towering hunter, larger than the rest, its body bristling with weapons that gleamed under the sun. It marched forward like a giant executioner, each step shaking the earth. Corin felt his courage falter. How could they fight something like that? He glanced at Kazai, who stood tall now, eyes blazing with unearthly fire. "My fight," Kazai said, voice steady. "But yours too." Corin swallowed hard, gripping his blade until his knuckles turned white. The giant machine roared, unleashing a barrage of searing bolts. Kazai raised his hands, shimmering energy forming a barrier that shook under the onslaught. Corin darted forward, dodging fire, climbing the creature's leg like a desperate insect. He hacked at joints, pried at panels, anything to weaken it. Sparks rained down, searing his skin, but he did not stop. Every blow was a declaration he would not be forgotten. He would not be useless. Kazai unleashed a final surge of power, his body blazing with light as he shouted in his own tongue. The energy struck the giant hunter like a thunderclap, tearing through its armored chest. At the same moment, Corin drove his blade into a seam, prying it open just enough for the energy to rip the machine apart from within. The explosion hurled them both to the ground, sand and fire raining around them. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of burning metal. Corin lay gasping, his body bruised and battered. Beside him, Kazai glowed faintly, his wounds closed, his strength returned. They had done the impossible, they had survived. He turned his head to see the smaller hunters retreating, their red eyes dimming as they scattered into the desert. The battle was over, at least for now. Corin let out a ragged laugh, the sound torn between relief and disbelief. For the first time in his life, he felt like a warrior. Kazai knelt beside him, placing a hand on his chest. "Corin, strong," the translator echoed. The words struck deeper than any wound. Strong. No one had ever called him that before. Tears stung his eyes, but he didn't look away. He had always been weak, forgotten, invisible. But today he had stood against the impossible. And he had mattered. He would never forget that. The desert lay in ruins, the outpost shattered, machines smoldering in heaps. Kazai gazed toward the horizon, his eyes distant. Home. Must return, but you come too. Corin's breath caught. The stars, those endless lights he had always stared at from the gutter, suddenly felt within reach. The idea seemed impossible, absurd. Yet Kazai's gaze was steady, offering him a hand not just in gratitude but in partnership. A choice lay before him, remain the outcast or step into destiny. He thought of the city that had abandoned him, the people who would never see him as anything but trash. Then he thought of the stars, of battles and wonders beyond his comprehension, of Kazai's trust, His decision formed with clarity he had never known. He clasped the alien's hand, hauling himself upright despite his pain. "I'm coming," he said, his voice raw but certain. "Wherever you go." Kazai smiled, a faint but unmistakable expression, and nodded. Together they turned away from the ruins and began their march across the desert. The horizon stretched endless before them, but for the first time Corin did not see emptiness. He saw possibility. He saw a path leading beyond the earth, beyond the limits of his forgotten life, into a destiny he had never dreamed of. As the sun sank, painting the dunes gold, their shadows stretched long and defiant. One was a man who had once been invisible. The other, an alien soldier who had nearly been lost. Together, they walked toward a future neither could face alone. And for Corin, the outcast who had saved a stranger from the stars, it was the beginning of a life that finally had meaning.